Hi, I'm Ralph Green, and thank you all for coming out today. I really appreciate you all coming out to listen to me talk about my master's thesis that I did with my mentor and advisor, Dr. Begley Miller. I think she did a good job explaining it, and my title is a pretty good summary of it, actually. It's called White-tailed Deer Harvest Success and its Impact on Forest Understory Vegetation, Evaluating Management Program Efficacy in Southeastern New York. And so before I get into this whole project, I think it'd be best to get a little bit of background info on why I'm here to talk to you today about deer and trees. And that's because from a young age, I grew up in a very outdoor background. I've been hunting for a long time with my father and his family. And I don't want people to think that this is about hunting and killing deer, because it's really not. And quite honestly, I have more gray hairs on top of my head right now than I do deer that I've successfully hunted in my life. So when I was hunting and from such a young age, and now I've grown up and haven't been able to really hunt a lot, especially with going to school and working on this project has taken up a lot of my time. I found a lot of peace there, just sitting amongst the forest and all the trees in the woods, and being able to see the deer. And I always had a wonder about it. And like I said, I found a lot of peace there and it brought a lot of peace into my life. And I always wondered about the deer and their interactions that they have with the forest. And now, I have this opportunity to do so with this project. And I think it's the best that I can get to it. So before I bore you with my personal life, let's get into it. So I think we all know about deer. In a study, I'm looking at white-tailed deer. And if you don't, it's okay. They're a common species throughout the northeastern portion of the country, and they're a very important herbivore species as well. So you might be wondering, then why are we talking about them? That's because, well, white-tailed deer are actually a pretty good conservation success story. In the turn of the 1900s, the deer population was very low. So we started implementing more regulations and started managing deer very well, and their population bounced back. But as time went on, us humans also created, more issues for ourselves, and allowing the population to increase substantially in the past 50 years, especially here in Southeastern New York. Like I said, it's a combination of a lot of reasons that, we have done. And it starts with like the loss of natural predators such as wolves and cougars. So now we've taken away from the things that decrease their population naturally. And we've also given them supplemental food resource through agriculture, like cornfields and all that. And also like our lawns also act as supplemental food resources for them as well. So now we've decreased their natural predators, we've increased their food resources, and also our lawns do act as safe havens for them. And now that leaves people who hunt as the primary way to control deer, but their numbers are also decreasing over the past 50 years. And we're also seeing a lack of recruitment of younger hunters and people who would pick up hunting. So with the loss of hunters and the general recruitment of them, we're also seeing an increase in stricter hunting regulations in suburban areas. And I'll be going more into detail about that. But another thing, I talk a lot about deer population increase, but it's more becoming an issue of deer density, because we're taking away a lot of their natural habitat and fragmenting our forests now with the development. And that's what humans love to do. So now we have a lot of deer, but now it's a lot of deer in these smaller spaces. So that's creating a carrying capacity issue. So as I said, there's a lot of development going on. So in these suburban areas, deer density has peaked. And so there's a lot of issues that arise from deer density. And with this project, I wanted to focus a lot on the forest. And there's also been studies about, the health of deer being impacted. I'm sure everybody knows about CWD, but let's just say for a second that you don't care about the forest and you don't care really much about the health of the deer herd or the individuals. But I will say that you do have a stake in this issue, because with the increase in deer density and deer populations, there has been a substantial increase in human deer interactions over time. Most specifically, like landscape and property damage. Like I said, our lawns act as a food resource for them as well, and all those nice trees that you plant. But also, you and your pet are more susceptible to the spread of Lyme disease through the ticks that they carry. So, you and your dog not doing so hot with Lyme disease. And then we also see the increase in automobile accidents with deer. In New York State alone, 65,000 deer vehicle collisions occur annually. So now, I think this issue really does impact you as well, even if you do not care about like the things that I'm going to be going over in this study. But like I said, I really wanted to focus about the impact that they're having on, where we think deer live, or where we always think that deer are in the forest. That's their food, that's their home, and where they get their natural food resources from. So upon reviewing the literature there, it's how I describe deer feeding patterns is that, like us, we eat the things that are easier for us to eat and taste good. They're very selective with their browsing patterns. And that can create a lot of problems when we see increase of deer density. They prefer a lot of the native woody tree seedlings that are very palatable to them, as well as herbaceous plants that are found in the forest understory, because deer aren't eating trees, they're eating the plants that they could reach, which are all of those little plants on the forest floor. And this directly impacts the structure, regeneration, and diversity of the forest, because the understory holds a lot of that future forest regeneration. As time goes on, whatever's on the ground of the forest will become, well, at least from tree seedlings, will become the future trees of the forest. So, and also the understory is really important because a lot of those plants also benefit a lot more species than just deer, like ground nesting birds and insects, and especially pollinators. A lot of those understory plants act as a pollination source for pollinators as well as far into the fall. And also, I just wanted to make note how ecologically important the understory is, because it may be only 1% of the biomass of the forest, but it can hold upwards to 90% of the diversity within the entire forest. So there's a lot at stake with this. And before I move on to how we work with this problem, I think I can only talk so much and put so many words in front of your face. So I made this little depiction. It displays really well what I want to talk about. It's a little limited by clip art on PowerPoint, so please bear with me, but I think you get the point. This could be any forest in your backyard, a state forest, a state park, and we have the adult trees here, and here's the forest understory. Like I said, the future generations of the forest. We have these yellow flower looking plants, which are those understory plants that I was telling you about that are very, important to a lot of other species. And then we have smaller tree seedlings here, and taller ones that may be a year or two older. And with life and everything in the natural world, there's a balance. And another really overused saying is that everything is good in moderation. And so here we have a moderate amount of deer, and it has been found in moderate deer density levels, it can facilitate a healthy forest understory where there's a lot of diversity and a lot of regeneration going on. But let's say that there's a similar, maybe a plot that's like 2 to 3 times the size of this one nearby, and we develop it into an Amazon warehouse. And that displaces all the deer that live there, and they're left with coming here. And of course, they have to eat something to survive. So first, by preference, those very important understory plants will go first. And now we're seeing a great loss of diversity. And then next is the more palatable and preferred tree seedling species that are native, and they will go. And there's also been found in the literature that this can facilitate the invasion of non-native and invasive species as well. So with more time passes by, of course, they're going to move on by preference. We see all the native species really diminish, and we're left with these barren open forests where you might be walking through them and you notice there's a lot of Japanese barberry, and you don't want to walk through that. And deer definitely don't want to eat that. So there's a lot at stake. And how do we really work with this problem? What do we do to make it better? And I'm going to tell you right away that we're not going to stop developing anytime soon. So that leaves us to control the deer. And recreational hunting has been our way of controlling deer over time. But like I said, we've seen a lot of natural predator loss. And, we see this picture here of a young Ralph. That might as well be in like a history book or a text or an archive, because we see this decline in the social acceptance of hunting, leading to the decrease of amount of hunters, as well as the recruitment of younger hunters and others who wish to participate. And on top of that, we're also dealing with more stricter regulations going on in developed areas, where I'm not here to criticize that, but we shouldn't be using firearms anywhere near buildings. It's from a very safety standpoint. I know a lot of hunters are good people who would make smart decisions, but there are people who, might be bad. So this leaves hunters with limited opportunities and just using bows, and they have been proven to have much more limited range and can lead to lower harvest rates over time. But it has been found that regulated hunting can reduce deer densities over time, and hopefully this helps the forest understory. And then those studies have found that where the understory can recover once we start improving or lowering the deer density to carrying capacity. So back to our display here, let's say we implement regulated hunting and we start to remove a few individuals, and the density lowers over time. And this can, and hopefully it can, facilitate the recovery of the forest understory to back to what it once was. more deer over time, maybe more recovery goes on. I can't speak too much about how it works with the invasive species being there and how persistent they are, but a lot of the studies have seen the improvement of the understory and abundance in the forest understory with managed deer, and I'm hoping that's what I find with this study. So I haven't lost you. I just want to kind of recap some of the more high points of this, and where it's been well documented that overabundant white-tailed deer populations do decrease the structure and diversity and richness of the forest understory over time. And the only way that we can really work with it is by using lethal management to reduce deer densities over time. And so this study aims to better understand the effectiveness of white-tailed deer management programs in improving forest understory conditions. And to be a little bit more specific, because I really do want you to understand what I wanted to do. So I looked at these different lethal management strategies of controlling white-tailed deer, whether they be recreational hunting or highly managed coordinated programs, or culling, which is, it's not fair chase, it's just moving as much deer as possible. And I wanted to see which of those programs were more successful at decreasing overall deer density over time. And if there was any decrease, no matter how big or small, and if it was there, I wanted to see if those densities correlated with improved forest understory conditions. So now I want to take some time to explain the management strategies that I looked at with the study, and then I'll be able to go into my hypotheses. So first, we have recreational firearm hunting. It's open access to the public, open to the general public, and they follow New York State regulations for firearm hunting. I have a site that does that. And then next, I have highly coordinated archery programs, which again follow New York State archery regulations. But this time we're seeing that the land managers and stewards coordinate with the hunters on where to be to maximize opportunity and harvest efficiency over time. So we have a few sites that do that. And then we have culling. Like I said, this picture here is like an outrageously big pile of corn. And it's probably illegal in most parts. But I do have a site that uses professional sharpshooters to cull their deer. And then lastly is my control group, which is no management. Sorry if it's a little blocked off, which is no management. And they don't hunt, they don't do anything to deer, so they do nothing. And this can lead into my first hypotheses. And with my first two hypotheses, they're broken into two parts to just make more sense. So with hypothesis 1A, if a site does not manage their deer, then they will have the highest levels of deer density. So with hypothesis 1B, if they don't manage their deer, then they'll have the lowest levels of forest understory abundance and diversity. So it sets up hypothesis 2 as the opposite, where if a site does manage their deer in any way, they will have the lowest levels of deer density. And if they do manage the deer in any way, they will have the highest levels of forest understory conditions. So moving on to my last two hypotheses, they're more focused on the different strategies. And the boxes surrounding them are important for later on. So in this dash box, we have firearm hunting and culling. So hypothesis 3 is that if a site manages their deer with firearm hunting or culling, it'll be the most efficient management strategy and lower deer densities. And hypothesis 4 is that if firearm hunting and culling are the most efficient management strategies, they'll have the highest levels of those forest understory conditions. So then that leaves, it kind of sets up a spectrum really for the management programs where none will have the lowest efficiency, of course, because they don't manage their deer in high density, and they'll have the lowest levels of those forest understory conditions. And then that'll place the highly coordinated archery programs in the middle with moderate efficiency and moderate levels of the forest understory conditions. And so I did have to do this. So I made this map in QGIS in New York State, and I'm focusing in on Southeastern New York here. So I worked with the Environmental Monitoring and Management Alliance to do this project. And they worked with me, and now I'm going to go over the strategies that they use to manage their deer. And first, starting off with the sites who don't manage their deer, which were the Edmund Niles Hike Preserve and the Rockefeller University Field Research Center, here indicated by the bold boxes. Then we have Vassar College Farm and Ecological Preserve, who uses the professional sharpshooters to manage their deer. And similarly, we have Black Rock Forest Conservatorium, who uses open access firearm hunting. And then lastly, in tightly dashed blocks, is Ward Pound Ridge Reservation, Teatown Lake Reservation, and Mianus River Gorge Preserve, who use highly coordinated archery programs. So moving on, like I said, I had to do this somehow. So I used 3 criteria to determine the differences between program efficacy. First, of course, was to compare harvest efficiency, or the number of deer taken per hour effort. Second was to compare relative changes in deer density between years to determine which programs have most affected the local deer population. And then last, I made a big point about vegetation. So I compared vegetation characteristics. And this included looking at woody seedling densities and their height, as well as the presence or absence of key understory plant taxa, which are deer preferred plants that I'll be going over very shortly. But really, it boils down to one thing. Do deer density and vegetation conditions correlate or not? So like I said, I needed data to do this and to work with these criteria. So I met with these sites and they agreed to compile a lot of data with me to work with. And so here we have each site in alphabetical order in their program type. And first is the vegetation data. So you'll see right away that I have here that what they provided me and when. So they have the years that they provided me, and you notice that all of the years are different. They all start at different times and end at different times. And when I collected supplemental data, if I needed to, I have that year provided as well. Also, you see that Emma already has a regeneration project where they monitor their vegetations. They use these 10 by 10 paired plots, which one of them is fenced to keep out deer, where the other is unfenced to allow deer so they could assess the impact of the deer having on the forest. And so most of them were all the same 10 by 10 meters. Black Rocks was 10 by 20, and some sites use quadrats to measure their vegetation. So I'll explain the curation process shortly. Next is deer density. Of course, I needed the yearly estimates to compare deer density over time and the change. So again, I have the years that they provided that and the method that they use. And right away, you notice that they all use different methods. And for a very long time, every site only really used one method. And then until as of recent, they started combining methods to have more precise and accurate estimates for their deer. But they use like winter tracking and pellet counts and camera surveys and forward-looking infrared to estimate their deer. And then lastly here is harvest records, which again, I have the years that they provided them and how they broke them down. So what I mean by that is that they tell me the number of bucks, does, fawns, and their total amount of deer harvested over time, or for each year, sorry, as well as the hours spent per year. And if they did, they calculated their deer per hour. But if they did not provide that, I was able to calculate it myself. And so now I have all this data. And like I said to you, I did have to do some supplemental collection. So first, we're going to talk about the vegetation data that I supplementally collected in the summer of 2020 and 2021. I did this for all the sites except for one of them, which was T-Town. And I needed to do this to fill in the gaps and just give a general update if it was needed. So here you see me living my best life, very happy measuring this red oak seedling. I do love to monitor vegetation. Don't let that confuse you. So this was done in two parts. And like I said, the presence or absence of key understory plant taxa. And that was what I'm talking about is deer preferred plants, which I'll be referring to from now on as deer indicator plants. Those are mostly herbaceous species. Only one of them wasn't herbaceous, which was Maple leaf viburnum. The rest of them are all herbaceous, such as Canada mayflower, the Solomon seals, false Solomon seal, whitewood aster, and jack in the pulpit. So I identified them the species, I measured their heights in centimeters, and I kept a total record of the number of individuals of each species by each site. And then monitoring tree seedlings was similar. I just observed every seedling that was there and present. Tree seedlings were classified as seedlings that were less than 3.8 centimeters diameter at breast height. And like I said, it was similar to the deer indicator plants, except I kept the status of they're living or dead or not. And to curate all of this, it was very simple. I just had to square it. I just had to aggregate them to represent the same amount of size that was measured across all sites, so 100 meters squared. That'll make more sense as we get to the results. So talking about deer data, the deer density and the deer harvesting, I will say that I did not go out and participate in any harvesting of supplemental harvesting of deer for any of the programs, so none of that happened. But I did need some deer density estimates for the sites who don't manage their deer. Since they don't manage their deer, they don't have estimates. So at Rockefeller and Hike at the fall of 2020, at the beginning of October, I set up camera trap surveys and took them down in the beginning of November. And I used Jacobson's branch antler survey method to estimate their deer densities. And here you see me setting up and checking a camera. And then here's a buck at Hike that I caught. And to curate that, it was very similar where I aggregated them all to deer per square kilometer, and the harvest records were already scaled when I do deer per hour effort. So now we're going to start going and looking at some of my results that I was able to produce, and specifically the deer density, deer harvest related results. And this is a picture I caught on my camera. I really like this doe looking into the camera with the sun coming up. But let's first get into it. I'm going to be doing a lot of explaining. So we're going to look at the total amount of hours spent by each program and site. So here we see hours spent by the programs. But down here, you see this metric called years since start of program. So like I said earlier, everybody started collecting data at different times. There's so many different lengths of observation that I had to work with. So the easiest way to equally compare all of them was to create the metric called years since start of program, which is YSP. And basically what that is, if you started in 1990, that is year zero. And every year after that subsequently becomes year one, year two. So like 1991 is year one, 1992 is year two, and so on. So that's what this is. So the hours against the year since they started their programs. So each site here is plotted by its program type. And we see right away that Black Rock's firearm hunting by far spends the most amount of hours. And it's very steady and constant. It slightly is increasing over time. And then next, we see the archery programs at Ward Pound Ridge and Mianus spending a lot less time than them, but still more than the rest of the programs at around 1,000 hours per year. Out of the archery programs, T-Town spends the least amount of time, right around under 500 hours a year. And we see that the program that spends the least amount of time is Vassar's firearm call. And so it's nice to see these times and all the time that they spend on their programs. So how does it affect their deer? So now we're going to look at the deer density change over time for all these sites and program types as well. And now we can incorporate the sites who don't manage their deer. So we're looking at the deer per kilometer squared. I aggregated them, or sorry, curated them so that they're all uniform to compare. And again, it's by year since start of program type. So what we see, we're going to start with the managed programs, and we see that the archery programs at T-Town and Ward Pound Ridge have significantly decreased their deer densities over time, very drastic and steep changes downward. And then what's surprising is that Vassar's firearm call is slightly increasing over time, but I want you to make note that there's a lot of variation going on in their yearly estimates. That's also not to say that there's variation going on in the other program types, but they definitely have the most variation. And then next we see Black Rock's firearm hunting, as their deer density is very moderate to low, and it's very constant, steady over time, just like the amount of hours they spend. Whereas Mianus has the lowest amount, that has the lowest deer density out of any site, and it's steadily decreasing over time. So now we can look at our unmanaged sites, and we see that Hike has the highest deer density out of all of them, which makes sense, they don't manage their deer. But then we see what's alarming is that Rockefeller is closer to a moderate deer density, and they don't manage their deer. Only Hike, well, Vassar has a little bit higher, even though so. It's just really interesting to see. And so I used an analysis of variance, and the analysis of variance found that time and program type were significant to the deer density over time. So I'm going to support hypothesis 1A and 2A here, because the sites that do manage their deer see decrease or stabilization of deer population over time, whereas the unmanaged sites do have moderate to higher deer densities. So now I remember talking about efficiency of my hypotheses. So let's look at the efficiency of these program types. So here we have the deer harvest per hour effort plotted against the first 5 years since the start of the program for all of these sites. And right away jumps out that Vassar's firearm call is the most efficient program type by far, but is drastically decreasing in efficiency over time. And all the program types are either slightly decreasing over time or not. As we see with the archery programs here, they have pretty moderate to low efficiencies, and they start decreasing as well. And Black Rock's firearm hunting is the least efficient program by far, and it is steadily low over time. So what was interesting that I found is that Mianus and T-Town do a supplemental archery call in the winter over bait for a single month, and its efficiency has steadily increased over time. So it's interesting to think about that, because maybe the efficiencies are declining because there's less deer for the hunt, or maybe because they're becoming more educated to avoid harvest, and which is why the supplemental call is so successful, by taking advantage of the deer needing to eat during the winter months. But anyways, not to go too far off path, an analysis of variance found that time and method were significant to program efficiency. So I'm going to partially support hypothesis 3 here, because firearm calling was the most efficient, but firearm hunting was the least efficient. And now we talked a lot about deer. So let's look at the vegetation results that I was able to produce after looking into deer stuff. And so what better way than to look at the seedling densities at all of these sites. So here I have the density of seedlings per 100 meters squared, since like I said, some of the plot sizes were different, or they collected them from quadrats. And these are all plotted by the year since start of program. And right away, it's really noticeable that, or surprising, that Rockefeller has the highest seedling density out of any site, and they don't manage their deer. The only sites that managed their deer and had a positive relationship with their seedlings over time and the change in deer density were T-Town, which we see here, is steadily increasing over time, and Vassar's Farm Coal, which is slightly increasing over time. Whereas the rest of the sites don't really have high or significant seedling densities. And this is very surprising. And I also was able to calculate the overall change in deer density for the programs and the unmanaged programs as well by taking the earliest, the most recent record, subtracting it by its earliest record to see the change over time. So in this analysis of covariance, I found that time in the change of deer density was not significant to the abundance of seedlings. And the story is very similar for tall seedlings. So remember I said I wanted to look at height. So tall seedlings are just what I categorize as seedlings taller than 40 centimeters. And still Rockefeller has one of the highest densities of tall seedlings, and they don't manage their deer. We just see that Vassar's Farm Coal is doing really well. It's significantly increasing over time, but all the rest of the sites are very insignificant. And again, the analysis of covariance found that time and the change in deer density are not significant to the abundance of tall seedlings either. So for the sake of not crowding the next slide, I'm going to reject hypothesis 1B and 2B here because we're seeing an unmanaged site have a much better vegetation response as compared to sites who manage their deer. But like I said, diversity was a really big part of the talk earlier on. So now I use Shannon's diversity index to find the diversity scores within the plots at each site. And here we have that score plotted against the total change in deer density, as I mentioned earlier. So right away, at no change in deer density because they don't manage their deer, we see Hike here has some of the lowest scores. Well, they are the lowest. They have the lowest scores out of anyone. And then we see here Rockefeller has no change in deer density. They don't manage their deer, but they have such high diversity scores, and that's really surprising. But we do see with slight change in deer densities, BlackRock's firearm program, and they have pretty high. They have some of the higher diversity scores out of anyone, and we see this trend with slight change in deer density, or with change in deer density increasing. We do see improvement of diversity scores, where the archery programs at Mianus and T-Town have moderate to high changes in deer density, and they do have some pretty good and high scores as well. But what's surprising is that Vassar's Farm Coal has the most change in deer density, but some of the lowest diversity scores among all the programs as well. And it's really interesting to think about how we're seeing these responses the way we are. I will say an analysis of covariance found that time and the change in deer density was marginally significant to understory diversity, but still, since there's no clear indication that managing your deer is better for the diversity as well as compared to unmanaged, and based on how hypothesis 3 and 4 are based off the efficiency of firearm hunting and culling, I'm going to reject hypothesis 4. And so now, like I said, this really makes me wonder, why is there such a better vegetation response at a site who doesn't manage their deer? How can this be? And it makes me think of the species composition. I'm going to be getting into that shortly. And it makes me wonder about species being browse persistent or browse tolerant. And that's kind of the case when I looked at the seedling. So this graph depicts the seedlings that are found, the seedling species that were found at least 50% of the sites. And it shows their proportion of that species across all the sites within the exclusion, outside of the exclosures. So the orange here is inside of the exclosures. That means that, and that's what the score is, 67% of black gum species were found inside the exclosures at all these sites, whereas 33% was found in the control plots. And this graph really paints the picture of browse sensitivity to browse persistence, browse tolerance for all the species that are found at 50% of the sites. We see that black gum, witch hazel, and red maple are browse sensitive. But then it starts shifting towards the middle ground of neither browse sensitivity or browse tolerance with hickory species and red oak, American beech, chestnut oak, and then ash species and black oak and sugar maple really start displaying browse tolerance. So it makes you wonder if the seedlings that were looked at could have impacted the diversity scores as well as the abundance scores as well. And when we break this down by site, that it kind of really shows that look how different the species compositions are for all of the sites in this study. There was no species found at every single site. There was only 3 species. The way that I looked at this is that the only commonality was that there was 3 species that were found at least 4 sites, and that was red maple, sugar maple, and hickory species. Whereas the number really doesn't do any better when you look at least 3 sites or 2 sites. And there was 13 species that were unique to at least 1 site. And if you could guess, it was at Rockefeller. Most of those species were found at Rockefeller, and they had high diversity scores and they had a great, abundance of seedlings. And one of the things too is that I believe that the chestnut oaks Quercus montana had a legacy effect at that site, where because their seedlings were growing a little bit more shrub-like, and I think that's a browse impact going on there. And you can see here that there's shifting in that middle ground to the browse tolerance. And when we looked at 50% of the sites, they were there as well. So I think that's something that could be really thought about for future studies as well, is whether or not the seedlings are browse tolerant or browse sensitive, and where they fit in with that. So like I said, deer indicator plants were a big part of the study as well, and they really did their job. They did indicate, deer preference, and they can, really show us deer impact, because, here's maple leaf viburnum. That was the only species that wasn't herbaceous. They were the most browse sensitive plant in the study. Only 87% of them were found inside of the exclosures. And then a lot of them too were very browse sensitive, like false Solomon seal and hairy and smooth Solomon seal. And then we start shifting to the middle ground with Jasmine the pulpit and whitewood aster and Canada Mayflower. I'll show you their score. They were the most browse tolerant of the deer indicator plants. And I think these plants do a better job of indicating that impact of deer browse pressure. And perhaps they would be better to look at solely than looking at these seedlings as well, to, really get that impact that I wanted to show in this study, or at least wanted to find. And so, not to bore anybody anymore, I'm going to, start wrapping this up. So we found that culling was the most efficient method for reducing deer densities over time. They're a very efficient program. Something to think about is the costs of using a professional cull as well. A lot goes into that. But, looking at the vegetation response that I got, I do think that it's very site specific. There's a lot of site specificness going on in this study. And I think that could really account for the vegetation response I saw, and possibly the deer density. But, I still think that site better explained for the vegetation response than program type did. There are some other unmeasured factors that I didn't look into with this study, and I have been found that in the literature, you can impact vegetation over time, which is browsing history, soil conditions, and land use history. And I think they could play a role in the vegetation response that I found. But also, I also think about things like how deer density was estimated differently at all these sites, and that could have impacted some of my density related analyses as well. So some other smaller things is that poaching might be occurring at the unmanaged sites, like especially Rockefeller. It's a really low % chance, but it still could happen. But really, a big finding is that sites that manage their deer do see a decrease or stabilization of deer population over time, which is, if that's your goal, that's a really good thing, and you want that. But it doesn't really translate with the vegetation response. And it makes me wonder that maybe some seedling species are not as sensitive to changes in deer density as compared to, browse sensitive seedling species or those deer indicator plants that I looked at. And I think a future study using solely those might yield better results than I found. But, if there's something I really want you to take away from the study, is that management and assessment of program success should occur at the site level, unless standardized metrics or protocols are implemented at the regional level, so that we could work with a regional analysis and compare this over a larger area instead of using the local site scale. But here are my references, I included throughout this presentation for my paper. But right now, I really wanted to, acknowledge and give thanks to everyone that I can. This is a picture of my dog, Stark. He's heard this talk way more than any of you will ever wish to hear. But I really would like to thank the Emma sites, Black Rock, Hike, my NST town, Vassar, Rockefeller, and Ward Pound Ridge for participating in the study and cooperating to work with me and dealing with me and giving me all this data to work with, because without them, this project wouldn't happen. And I'd also like to thank some supplemental data collectors and scribes in the field this year that worked with me, especially Dr. Begley Miller. A lot of plant ID that I learned is from her. I'm very grateful for all the good times that we had. I'd like to thank my girlfriend, Jess, for, coming out and, being dragged through the forest with me and helping so much. I'd also like to thank my father, Ralph Green, for coming and helping me collect cameras from the camera trap surveys and, retrieving them. And I'd also really like to take a second to thank all my family and friends and colleagues who are here or not, that have provided so much love and support for me throughout all of this. And without you guys, it really wouldn't be possible. And I'd probably be defending this in next May. And I'd also like to take a second to thank my committee members, Dr. Ellen Lemons and Dr. Rubo, for all of their support and positive feedback to help me produce the best work and present it to you today. And, last but definitely not least, I really like to thank my advisor and mentor, Dr. Begley Miller. Without her, this really isn't possible. I know without a lot of people, it's not possible, but without her, it's really not. She has really guided me along the way, and I cannot be more grateful for that. She's always helped me produce some of my best work and always just helped me be the best that I could be with everything that I do. And like I said, I cannot express how grateful I am for her. So thank you so much. And for all of you here today, thank you too for coming. I really appreciate all the support and listening to me talk today and dealing with me. So with that being said, if thank you again. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them now. But otherwise, I really hope you have a great day.